Hello and welcome to the latest GESS Talks Webinar, the MENA Education Sector, a Blueprint for Success in association with ISC Research. We'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. A few bits of information before we get underway. For all attendees, you can find the control panel on the side. There's a Q&A tab and another one for handouts. Please feel free to browse and download those at any time during the webinar. Please also feel free to use the Q&A, ask us questions, as the panelists would love to hear your thoughts. We'll do our very best to get through them all, but if we don't manage to, the system saves them down and we'll get back to you after the event. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our fantastic panel for this discussion. Our chair and moderator, Diane Glass, Commercial Director at ISC Research, George DeBakey, President of DeBakey International, Jim Stearns, Deputy Principal and Head of Secondary at the Victoria International School of Sharjah, Nalini Cook, Head of Research, Europe, Middle East and Africa at ISC Research, and last but not least, Steve Whitley, founder of EdTech Consulting. Thank you, and over to you, Diane.
Thanks very much indeed, Danny, and welcome to everybody. Today's session is going to be focused on the opportunities for education suppliers within the international schools market in the Middle East, with additional reference to successful engagement with ministries of education in the region. How have the events of the past 18 months affected the international schools in the region? And what are the implications of this for businesses supplying into the schools? For those of you who don't know ISC Research, a quick introduction. ISC is actually the only company in the world specializing in the collection of data and market intelligence on the global English medium K-12 international schools market. And we work with independent schools, international schools, groups that own and manage the schools, government bodies and investors. We also work with universities, the world's media and education suppliers. The education suppliers use ISC's online database to identify all of the international schools, understand what sort of schools they are, and then connect with their key decision makers and stakeholders at the schools. International schools are really a crucial sector for any education supplier that's looking to expand their business internationally. And there are a number of reasons for that. I mean, I suppose the most important one is that it's a dynamic education sector. It's profitable and it carries on growing and has carried on growing actually even over the past 18 months. It's a market in which you can do business very easily in English, and the schools are making their own buying decisions, so no long drawn out negotiations with local education ministries. The schools are teaching curricula that are familiar to all Western suppliers, so no need for product development in order to supply into the schools. I guess the main driver behind the growth in the international schools market has really been this continuing demand for an education in English at best quality schools in the right sort of way. So pedagogy that looks at collaborative learning, research, etc., all of which lends itself to a successful place at a university of choice, and then all of the career options that are open to students after that. Danny mentioned the handouts, and included in those handouts is a summary from ISC Research, a report on the Middle Eastern international schools market. If you'd like to learn more and go beyond that summary, then please do get in touch with me. We have 3 country market reports that we've published this year that we would like to give away if you want to get in touch. There's a report on the UAE, one on Qatar, and one on Saudi Arabia. So first of all, we're going to come to Nalini. Nalini is going to give us a short presentation on the latest market data and market trends. But perhaps before you do that, Nalini, you could introduce yourself a little bit more.
Of course. Thanks, Diane, and thanks, GESS, for inviting me to speak here today. As Danny mentioned, I am Head of Research for the EMEA region at ISC Research. We look at both quantitative and qualitative data. My regular day-to-day job would be actually physically going into schools, probably somewhere between about 200 and 250 every academic year, and speaking with the school leaders face to face, asking, what's going on in admissions, what trends are you seeing in staff recruitment, what challenges are you facing this year, those types of questions, for us to have a better idea of what's going on behind the data, behind the actual figures. Obviously, we're mid-pandemic, so that's all been on Zoom or Teams this year, so it's a little bit different, but we're still having those same conversations to enable us to understand what's really going on in the market, and then share it with people at presentations like this. So as Diane said, I'd like to just share a couple of quick slides with you to just give you an idea of the context of the market, both globally and in the Middle East, so that we can discuss a little bit more through the rest of this presentation. So bear with me as I just open these slides up, and hopefully everybody can see that right now. So this slide that you're looking at just here is, it shows ISC's global international schools market data. And you can see here that the market's grown pretty steadily over the last 10 years. It's also a sector, as Diane mentioned, that's demonstrated really some significant resilience despite global economic challenges, whether that was the financial crisis back in 2008, 2009, or the pandemic more recently. The bottom line that you see across the screen there is illustrating the compound annual growth rate over the last 10 years. So you can see that steady growth there. Now, moving on, this is the global data since the COVID outbreak, and some possible future data as well. Now, we're not forecasting in any detail this year as such, mainly because a huge amount of uncertainty remains. But we are constantly hearing of new schools opening. There are lots of schools being planned at various locations around the world, and we would expect growth to be around 1% if it continues in the same vein as it has done over the last 12 months since the pandemic. If things calm down and we start to emerge from the pandemic, then we might be looking at something closer towards a 5% growth, which is what we were on track for pre-pandemic. Now, focusing on the Middle East and North Africa region, to give you some context as to what we're going to talk about today, the MENA region has the most international schools of any sub-region globally. And you can see here the rate of growth in comparison to those global figures that I showed you just now. From top to bottom, you're looking at the number of international schools, the number of international students at those schools, the number of teachers teaching in those schools, the total annual tuition fee income for the region, and finally the average annual school fee. Now, these are the global leading countries by school, but note that the UAE, although third along for the number of schools, it actually has the highest number of students for any country. Top right, you can see an insert there that shows the leading 3 countries in the MENA region. So you might be interested to know that as well as those figures there that you've got for schools, the UAE has another 17 schools planned for the next academic year alone. Saudi Arabia has 12 new schools in the pipeline, including 3 next academic year, and a first, which is the Kings, a UK branded independent school, which is opening in Saudi. And just today, SEK International has announced that they're also opening a school. That's going to be in Riyadh. And Egypt has 22 future schools currently in the pipeline, but we're expecting that to increase very soon, as we're hearing of a lot of operators looking at expansions there. Now, these are the big hitting countries in the Middle East, but don't forget we've also got places like Qatar with 207 schools, Oman has 107, Bahrain has 68, and of course Jordan, etc., etc. So These are still huge numbers of international schools per country compared to a lot of other countries around the world. And they all have multiple new schools opening in the next few years, just to give you an idea of the growth of the market. But don't imagine that the Middle East, even the Gulf states, are one homogenous region. Local culture and regulations, fees, they can all vary hugely, and it's important to take note of that. The makeup of student bodies and teacher nationalities can be very different, as can school resourcing requirements and indeed budgets. Now, COVID has obviously been on everybody's mind for some time now, and the responses have also varied massively. Saudi and Kuwait, for example, have remained in remote learning since March 2020. So we're waiting to see what the new academic year will look like there. We're expecting it to be back to face-to-face learning, or at least there to be some kind of hybrid option. But it's certainly something to keep an eye on, because operations there are very different to those countries where face-to-face learning has been ongoing this academic year. There's been fluctuating border closures, and that's obviously affected international enrolment as well as teacher recruitment. And then my final slide just for now is some of the leading cities in the Middle East. So Dubai, as you can see there, has more international schools than any other city in the world. So it's worth noting just for that sheer concentration of schools. Doha's third and Abu Dhabi is fourth. So as you can see, these are highly competitive markets, which means schools often have to find ways to stand out, to highlight a difference about them. What is their USP? And that's certainly something that you as suppliers can help them with. So I'll leave that there. I hope that's been a good overview at least. And as Diane said, there is a report available in the handouts which will give you more information. Thanks, Diane.
That's great. Thanks very much, Nalini. And if I could just hold on to you for one moment. We've had a question in from Michael Campbell. Great to see that you're here, Michael. Michael's asking whether we have any idea on the number of schools in the UAE or other Middle Eastern countries who are going to fully open in the fall versus hybrid versus remote. Well, I mean, you've given us a summary of where we are now. I think we will be looking at what's going to happen in the fall. I'm speaking for you a little bit here, Nalini, but I'm imagining that that's what we need to do, is find out just how hybrid it's all going to be and where.
Yes, not as you may or may not already know, things can be somewhat last minute in terms of official announcements in the Middle East. So we're still waiting for announcements from a lot of countries, as I mentioned, Saudi and Kuwait, for example. But certain places are already showing their hand. So Sharjah has this week announced that they will be going back to face-to-face learning. Sharjah in the UAE, Abu Dhabi has announced the same. So slowly but surely these things are coming out. I certainly think everybody's hoping to be back to face-to-face learning, but I also know that everybody I've spoken to is preparing for hybrid learning and remote learning to continue just in case.
That's great. Thanks very much indeed. Steve, I'm going to come to you next, if I could, sure, please. And before you answer your question, if you want to give us a better introduction to the work that you do, that would be great. I'd like to ask you to speak about the need for suppliers to be aware of different requirements for different markets. Nalini mentioned, the fact that the Middle East isn't, all homogenous. It's made up of very different countries, different ways of doing business. And maybe you could also, look at the contrast between doing business with international schools and ministries. And, we'd be interested to hear some examples of work that you've been doing, helping education suppliers grow their business in the region.
Okay, sure. So my name's Steve Whitley. I'm the founder of EdTech Consulting. My background is initially 10 years working in the UK education sector, and then for the last 30 years actually in the EdTech side of the industry, selling back into schools, both in the UK and worldwide. And that involved an awful lot of time selling in the Middle East to both governmental schools and also private internationals. So that's my background. It is important to realise there's a very distinct difference, not just regionally, but in the type of school. So far we've really focused on international schools, which are a growing market, particularly in the Middle East and Asia, and are definitely high on the list of sort of targets I would point most companies at who are looking to begin or grow their international sales. The advantages you pointed out to begin with, Diane, mainly English speaking, lots of English expat teachers, or American or Australian, but certainly English as their first language, and an understanding and a desire to deliver a curriculum that we're all familiar with. They also tend to offer the advantage of often they wish to work directly with the supplier or manufacturer of the goods or service, and therefore are quite happy to work sort of semi-remotely, emails, Zoom, phone calls, etc. That is not to say that they don't still require that in-person approach, and so I would say that it needs to be a blended approach to marketing that does involve actually, you know, getting on an airplane, flying into the Middle East, going to shows, going to exhibitions, and actually, you know, going into schools. Although that is somewhat difficult at the moment, and I expect it to stay difficult for the rest of the year, but it's something that should be borne in mind. When you're dealing, however, with governmental schools, quite often the schools themselves have very little control. You may well find that it's a government level tender. And at that point, generally speaking, somebody on the ground supporting and helping to sell that product is quite important. So in the Middle East, with companies that I've dealt with and worked with in the past, we've taken a sort of mixed approach where the international schools predominantly have worked directly with us. However, the state level schools, the governmental schools, have been approached and worked with via a distributor on the ground. So it's somebody in Dubai, somebody in Abu Dhabi, somebody in Sharjah, equally somebody in Saudi, somebody in Kuwait, etc. So it's a case of building those partnerships, finding the right people to work with. Occasionally, an international school will want to deal with the local person, the local representative. I find that more often than not, they wanted to deal direct. The final impact on that really is the goods that you're actually supplying or the services. If you've got physical goods, having a distributor or an agent on the ground makes life a lot easier in terms of the shipping, transportation, installation, support, etc. If you're selling a predominantly or perfectly online system, then I think a direct approach is absolutely fine.
That's great. Thanks very much indeed. George, let me come to you now. Tell us a bit about yourself, and I'd like you to tell us about the experience that you have in doing business within the Middle East. You know, you've supported many education suppliers there, either launching or growing their business. So I'm interested if you could outline for us perhaps general principles of how to do business best locally, and take into account, if you could, any fallout that you've experienced because of COVID.
Yes, thanks. My background has been involved with the Middle East over the last 20, 30 years. I lived in Egypt for 4 years and then London for a couple of years in another life. As you may know, the Middle East relationships are very important. In fact, I think Jim Stearns School was one of the first schools I visited many years ago in Sharjah. I have found I've represented high-tech educational technology companies to help them expand overseas, mainly in the Middle East. I've worked with firms from the US, UK, Estonia, Australia, and even Middle East companies, actually. One of the things I have kind of different approaches, so some of them very similar to what Steve mentioned, is starting out working with international schools, mainly because international schools, well, there are the large ones like GEMS that owns many schools, but there are many schools that are independent, single schools. Decision making's faster compared to the US, where we have districts, more bureaucracy, if you will. So the internet, there's, as you saw, many international schools, and the UAE is a good place to start. I work in Kuwait, Egypt, Saudi Arabia is growing, as Nalini mentioned. I'm working on some projects there now, but usually trying to start directly, because many companies are small, don't understand the market, don't have the financial resources or expertise. Maybe start out doing some webinars or email campaigns. I work directly with some schools. We'll also get webinars signed up with some schools and have the companies give presentations. I always warn companies, this is a marathon, not a sprint. Don't expect tomorrow morning you're going to have sales. You might get some sales in 6 months. I've seen that happen, but I usually like to manage expectations. It may take 6 to 12 months to start developing a pipeline, build awareness. Some companies that I've worked with, after we kind of do some direct selling, we move into finding resellers that would represent them. That can be important depending on time zone issues, particularly with US companies. I've always emphasized that it's not just the sale, it's the implementation and training if you want to get renewals. I'm sure Jim can vouch for that. It's important not to overlook that. And I have experiences good and bad with companies who need to understand how important that is. I have also found since the COVID, I've been pleasantly surprised how much, well, I thought maybe business would somewhat dry up, and I haven't seen that. It may have slowed down some. I think it's going to be interesting, and Jim's comments with the new budgets probably starting with most schools now, July 1st. I've come across schools now are, looking for new technology to deal with the better technology for teaching and learning, not just Zoom, if you will. STEM products are very popular. I will always, professional development, products in Arabic are growing compared to a couple of years ago. Special needs are areas I've seen growing. The thing that I always like to emphasize to companies is, again, you've got to be realistic and make a commitment to doing this. It can be very good business. Many of them are surprised when you show the kind of statistics that Nalini showed earlier, the size of the market, and she showed just the Middle East there mainly, but the worldwide market is over 12,000. And again, we're just talking about international schools. I've also worked with ministries. I think it's good to try to start doing business there, but as Steve knows, it can be a slower process. So anyway, I'll kind of stop there and add comments later as we move along. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks very much indeed, George. Jim, let me come to you now, if I could. And again, if you can tell us a little bit more about yourself to begin with, that would be great. I know that as well as being a deputy principal, you're also an education technology specialist. So George has been talking about EdTech already, and without a doubt, that particular sector has absolutely thrived in many ways through soaring demand during the school closure. So it'd be good to hear a bit about that. But I'm interested to know, what are the key resources that schools in the Middle East are actually looking for now? We've learned so many lessons from distance learning. What do you think is missing still?
Yeah, look, thank you for that, Diane. And yeah, so I'm Jim Stearns. I'm head of secondary school and deputy principal at Viz. And before that, I've been doing that 7 years. Before that, I had 6 years as headmaster of Shoreham College, which is a small independent school on the south coast of the UK. And before that, I was a physics teacher. And indeed, have still teach a bit every now and then. So yes, I've always had an interest in technology, as you highlight. Something I've been very involved with in the UK and in the UAE. I think the interesting thing, it was good you highlighted, I think it was Nalini mentioned about Sharjah and the announcement this week, which we knew was coming. But it is interesting to say that there will be some elements, the data shows us there still will be students at home, and it's really trying to get that balance. We're a well-resourced, well-teched school. We were using most of the tools that we implemented. The only one we really went for in a new way was Zoom. We found in our school, in our context, Teams wasn't quite up to the job in terms of running whole classes. But Google Classroom has been very successful as well in other schools. Platforms like Seesaw, Edmodo, EdPerfect, that we were already using, obviously the use of those ramped up. And I think really moving forwards, people aren't necessarily looking for lots of new things. It's really about consolidating, finding out what's worked and fine tuning, knowing that, it's certainly there'll be some element of online. I mean, I think the really interesting thing is that, it shows that schools are still needed. And I think, it's something you might touch upon later. But, we've found that as we emerge, we're looking at consolidating, building on the successes and the products that have not let us down, that have served us well. We've always been very careful, like any good tech rollout school, to really plan what we do, and that, we had to throw that out the window and be very reactive. For example, I won the first iPad programs in the UAE. We've tried various learning platforms. We've often been beacon schools for companies who want to try stuff out, because again, we look at what's needed, how it's going to work, how it's going to serve us, and learning from the mistakes of the past, as it were. So I think, and George is right to touch upon the budgetary aspects. Like a lot of schools a year ago, 18 months ago, when things hit, we put the freeze on as much spending as possible. We want to focus on looking after our employees and looking after our community. But we did have to invest. We did purchase some platforms, try out some others. So I think really, schools will be now blinking into the sunshine. We're not out the woods yet, but we're certainly in a very strong position. And I think they will be looking to, they'll know where they are with their student numbers. They'll know where they are with their development plans, be able to dust up. I mean, for example, Viz, we've been a primary school and a secondary school on one campus for 11, 12 years. In the next 3 years, we'll be becoming a group of 5 schools, one of which is a new primary school is opening in August. 3 new primary schools the August after that. So, it's actually a really good time to be actually expanding, to be looking at, as long as you've got the resources to deliver as we emerge and the economies improve, then obviously you'll be well placed to take advantage of that. But in terms of what we're doing in school, as I say, really, some products have shunned. I think any product that schools have been using been tested to death. And what schools are looking to do is saying, okay, and I think one thing to highlight as well, that a lot of companies have made allowances, been generous with the use of their products. Zoom, for example, has been free to teachers during this process. It'll be interesting to see how long that lasts. Hopefully they've made enough money out of other people that they can continue with that. So it'll be interesting, the schools will be keeping an eye on that, what companies do with their products and their pricing, and if they're sensible, then they should do well in the market as we move forward.
That's brilliant. Isn't it great to hear people talking positively about good things on the horizon for the future? That's absolutely great. We've had a question in, and I'm just going to stay with you, Jim, for a moment. Sure. It's from David Weston, who I guess is David from Literacy Planet. So hello to you, David, if I've got the right David. So David's asking about planning trips, wants to come to GESS Dubai later on in the year, beginning to plan trips. But what about schools being open to visits? And we were actually talking about this, weren't we, when we prepared for the session. And I know that George brought up the fact that some schools, do want to meet with suppliers, maybe not in school, maybe outside of school, somewhere else. And I just wondered what your thoughts were for the new school year, for the new term.
Yeah. So look, we are still actually operating officially under the guidance that was published last August. We are anticipating revisions to that, but we're certain there'll still be elements of social distancing, bubbling, and all those things that we've been, we think they will be relaxed. It might be that the distance between the students is reduced to, say, 1 metre rather than 1.5 metres. But at the moment, we've not been having deliveries during the day. It's been very hard to meet people. But having said that, most schools like us, we have offices at the front of the school. So we certainly have met with suppliers when we've needed to. As I say, it's, we've got our established relationships, and, a lot of the key relationships, people are used to working like this. One of the companies we dealt with were a lot, EdPerfect. We've really ramped up the use of that learning platform. And we had an issue where some of their resources needed some cultural adjustment, shall we say. And again, in fact, they were very responsive, very quick to sort it out. And although they have representatives in the country, in fact, it was actually easy to sort it out over Zoom. But school tours during the day with students on site are still going to be a challenge, and I suspect that won't change. But certainly in terms of face-to-face meetings, off-site is a lot easier, as you say. Public places are open now, but I would suspect most schools would be able to facilitate some sort of meeting. We did a lot of parents meet. In fact, our parents' evenings we still run on Zoom. We found that's been a real success story. Teachers prefer it and parents prefer it. But we have certainly met parents face to face because we're able to do that at the offices we have near the entrances. So obviously I would encourage people to do their due diligence before they get on an aeroplane, just to make sure they've got some appointments. But certainly, if a supplier was in the area and wanted to visit us and we could fit them in, then we would certainly have we would be able to do that.
Yeah. Well, in fact, I was going to come to you, Steve, because I remember you mentioned when we talked last time about marketing and sales approaches needing to pivot as a result of the pandemic. And one of the things we spoke about was doing your homework better. Do you want to just talk a little bit about that? I know that you very much feel, meeting people is absolutely the best way to do business, but you were talking about smarter ways, weren't you?
Yeah, I think, if there are any good things we can learn from the pandemic, some of them are our routes to communicating with potential clients or actual customers has changed. I think, we are, to coin George's phrase, all zoomed out. We are very tired of it, but at the same time, I think we also accept that it's actually a really good way, perhaps, to begin a relationship. Too often I see sales pitches that begin with the email demanding an appointment or a LinkedIn message that says, when can we chat? It's just far too early in that process of getting to know somebody to ask for that appointment. It's almost like expecting, the full-on French kiss on the first date. You need to back off a little bit. And Zoom is a way that you might be able to actually have a conversation with somebody to begin to build a relationship. And it's not too much of a step for somebody who doesn't know you to hop on a quick call and at least get a feel for what it is you want to talk to them about. I think moving on at the moment, that concept of perhaps pushing a sales agenda that ends with a "can I come and see you, can I come and show you the product" is still going to be difficult, perhaps, for the rest of this year. So I think the pivoting perhaps is to push more towards would you be interested in a webinar, can I do an online demonstration, those sort of approaches. That's not to say that if you can get those appointments, get on a plane, because at the end of the day, people buy from people. You really need to get in front of those people. So certainly from my perspective, I'm saying to my clients, those of whom are in the right position, get themselves out to the GESS show, book some appointments around that. Those appointments might not be in school, however. You might be able to convince the school to come out and meet you at the stand at the GESS show. Or perhaps, you could say to an existing client, or perhaps even a new one, hey, where's the nearest Starbucks? Let's go meet there. Let's have a 20-minute chat over a coffee, because that might be the opportunity for you to have a much more in-depth discussion without putting the school into panic mode of trying to find a room and a safe place to put you, while the children are still in school. Alternatively, meet them at the hotel, meet them in the lobby of the hotel, go and get a drink in the hotel. If you are looking at bringing groups in, if you've reached the point where perhaps you want to talk to half a dozen people, hire a small room in the hotel and run a little seminar or whatever there. All of those are ways that you could make that physical contact without sort of stepping over the threshold of the door to the school. Yeah. It is inevitably more difficult for teachers to find the time to get out of school to come and meet you outside of school. But compared to the alternative, if you can't go into the school, some teachers may say, you know what, let's meet at 4 o'clock for a coffee, because I can do that and I don't need to put the school into chaos to do it. So I just think we need to think a little bit more carefully about what it is we're asking our clients, potential clients, to do, and the timing in which we sort of invoke that next level.
That's great. Thanks very much indeed. Nalini, you're talking to international schools across the region almost every day, as you said. What are you hearing are the most important resources and support that schools are in need of now and going into the future as well as things are settling down? And why is that? What are the key trends in the wider international schools market that education suppliers should know about, thinking about these resources?
Yes, thanks, Diane. I'm actually going to flip my answer, if you don't mind, and look at the trends first and then the resources that are stemming from that. So in preparation for this, I'd essentially made a list, and I've split it into 3 sections, and that's essentially long-term trends that we've been seeing for some years and are continuing, pandemic trends, and what things are going to look like in the future. So long term, I don't think these will come as a surprise to anyone, but just to reiterate, obviously we've mentioned the growth of the market overall, that is still continuing. We've mentioned a general demand for English language learning. English fluency is still seen as a key deliverable by international schools. Lots of parents are looking for their children to have access to either English-speaking universities, or indeed they see it as a contributor to career success later in their lives. One of the things we've talked about at ISC for some years is the local enrollment versus expat enrollment at international schools. Now, it used to be a 20% locals, 80% expats. International schools primarily serviced expat children. That's completely flipped, and certainly globally, that is now very much an 80% local attendance versus 20% expats. Now, obviously, there are differences. There are certainly nuances within different countries in the Middle East. So places like the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, etc., where there's huge amount of expats, those numbers are a little bit different. But if you look at places like Egypt or Saudi, Kuwait, indeed, it's very much a locally driven market. So that trend still continues. And obviously, there are some slightly different requirements when you're looking at the student body there. There's an increased interest in bicultural language and context learning. George noted earlier that Arabic resources are increasingly in demand. Certainly when I started exploring this market about 10 years ago, there really wasn't very much available in Arabic. There's a lot more bilingual provision now. In fact, the Swiss International School in Dubai is actually starting a trilingual program this coming academic year, where they're going to be offering Arabic fluency. So that's an interesting one. The pursuit of globally minded students who leave school with life skills, not just academic knowledge. That's something that's been emerging for some time, but it's really been driven home recently, I think. Parents are interested in the academics, obviously, but I think there's an expectation that at a lot of schools, those academics will be delivered regardless. They're now really concentrating on how else are you shaping our children for the future? How will they be able to cope with life and the world of work once they emerge from schools? More affordable mid-market fee schools. We haven't really touched on that yet. That's a huge trend. It was emerging pre-pandemic, but it's certainly there's been a move from a lot of people who were perhaps attending higher fee point premium schools towards the mid-market sector with more affordable fees. And UK, US and Australian independent school brands are expanding overseas as well. So whilst they only make up just over 1% of the total market, they're really expanding quite aggressively. We certainly know at ISC of 71 new schools in the pipeline that are of an independent brand that are going to open a sister school somewhere. Some of the other trends include a focus on well-being, sustainability. Again, they were emerging pre-COVID, but they've really been accelerated by the pandemic, particularly well-being. Lots of schools, and I'm sure Jim can attest to this, have had really some quite serious issues, mental health, various well-being challenges for their students over the last 18 months. Then some of the pandemic trends that I'd said I would mention. Obviously, there's been an increased demand for remote learning resources. Lots of schools are planning to continue remote learning practices, even when it's no longer necessary. Things like flipped learning or online resources. those types of things. And a focus on diversity, equity, inclusion and justice. That's certainly emerged over the last 12 to 18 months as something that's really very important to schools and their ethos. Lots of schools were already working towards this, but it's taken on a new intensity in recent months. To focus on the resources that I think are needed to support some of these trends that are emerging. Some of the specifics that schools have mentioned to me, and I'm sure the others will add to this later. Multiple early years and primary resources. So one of the things that's come out in a lot of the regulation across the region is that classes must be split either into smaller bubbles or they're doing alternate afternoons and mornings. And they require multiple sets of physical, tangible resources. They're not allowed to use the same set quite often. So, you know, whether that's books, whether that's toys, various learning resources for the younger years. Wellbeing tools, as I mentioned, wellbeing is key at the moment. But interestingly, not just for students. I'm hearing from a lot of schools that supporting community wellbeing is really important. So things that can support not just students, but staff and parents as well. Online books and resources, I don't think that'll be a surprise to anybody. Lots of schools are going towards permanently moving towards online resourcing rather than printed resources. Somebody mentioned earlier about consolidating IT resources, and I think that's a really important point. Initially in the pandemic, I think there was a lot of just bringing things on board to try and cope with the situation. People are now consolidating, but they're also looking for resources that integrate with their existing IT systems rather than having lots and lots of multiple bolt-ons. And finally, resources to support extracurricular activities. So certainly in Dubai, for example, schools still aren't able to run ECAs at the moment. So whilst they can have external companies come in, there is a bit of a dearth of provision there right now. So anything that can support remote ECAs or holiday club activities, particularly things like Duke of Edinburgh or CAS, if it's an IB school, those types of things would be really welcome. I hope that's given you a taste, at least, of some of the things that I'm hearing, Diane.
That's a fantastic answer. Thanks very
much. As fast as I could.
You've actually inadvertently answered one of the questions from our audience as well, Amanda Naylor.
Oh, good, great.
Hi, Amanda. As I think Nalini's answered your question there for you, so that's great. Jim, if you can manage it, and this is a big subject, I know, but could you give us a concise summary, do you think, of what lessons have been learnt from the effects of the pandemic in terms of new ways of providing best quality school provision? And I'm thinking of things that are going to stay with us or at least are under discussion as a potential long-term way of doing things.
Yeah, I think I'm actually going to, rather than, yes, I can, but actually one of my key answers doesn't quite answer it, because actually I think what we've all learned is that we still need schools, which is of some relief to me. As someone who's worked in one for his entire career and hopes to eke out a little bit of a living for the years to come. You know, I think we've shown that, you know, I'll blow our own trumpet. It's not something I'm prone to do because I'm English, but, you know, Viz has done really well. We had well-trained staff already. We had IT savvy students. They had the resources. They had the internet connections. So even we had problems, but we've done pretty well out of it. But we've all learned that, you know, flexibility, hybrid is great for a certain amount of time, but is not the answer. You know, children don't just come to school to learn stuff; they come to school to develop. And you know, Nalini was right to talk about the well-being issues. We have seen an increase in those sorts of issues. Our key plan is to rebuild our community in the coming term, and we have a pretty strong community already. Those students that have been online all year have struggled to engage, getting them back on site and going back to doing as Nalini says, doing the extracurricular activities and doing those community events. So that's what you know, really is the key focus. Having said that, of course, there are things that are much easier that we have learned. I mentioned parents' evenings earlier. Who'd have thought, you know, parents might, you know, don't like sitting waiting to spend 5 minutes talking to a teacher for a whole evening. That has been a real success, and it has been easier to you know, so platforms that you know, help with bookings, help facilitate that sort of thing, that could work really well. Another key thing that we haven't really touched upon is assessment. Assessment has been a challenge. It's been a constant target for us. There are lots of different ways in which online platforms have resources and assess those resources. I'm been on at my guys to just encourage them to evaluate very carefully what they've done. I think part of the downsides of what's happened is we've become slightly over-reliant on them, and it is hard to do rigorous assessments when you've got, say, 20% of the students at home. How do you get an even keel when you know some of those students are either struggling to engage, or at the other end of the scale, they've got their tutor or their mum and dad sitting next to them, supporting them, should we say. But that has caused us to become creative in the way in which we assess and use those platforms. And that's part of our job as professionals. So, in terms of what schools need from suppliers, notwithstanding all the community stuff I've just talked about, but, Nalini mentioned wellbeing resources, not just for students, but for the whole community. Assessment, we've learned online assessment can be great. It is more convenient, but there's a lot of work to be done around that. Arabic resources, George mentioned, it's a huge market. Even international schools in the UAE, and I'm sure it's across the region, it's the same, have to still do the ministry curriculum. So, developing in that area as well is something that I think a lot of companies could capitalize on.
That's great. Thanks very much indeed. I'm going to come to you now, George, if I could, because I want you to talk a little bit, if you could, about really how the businesses that you're working with have adjusted the way that they operate, because things have changed, haven't they, in terms of how the schools learn about important new resources and also how they engage with potential new suppliers. So how have the businesses that you're working with changed what they're doing, how they're doing, so that they can align with those new conditions around, the school supplier engagement and then relationship building? Do you think schools are looking to do business differently?
Yeah, I think in some ways they are. I think companies new to the market need to understand that how important relationships are and get exposure. You can't just and even visiting the region, you can't just visit the region once a year. I mean, that's why it's important maybe that you have a reseller if you don't have the financial resources. I think another thing that's been happening, and even before the pandemic, but probably more emphasized, you need to learn how can you show like a Jim Stearns or someone at a head of a school, and what the cost savings of your product. Many schools have bought over years 20, 30 different systems, and they don't talk to each other. They're kind of silos, and everybody's looking for that magic product that will get you down to 2 or 3. And there are many companies working on that to do better integration of your administrative, financial, teaching and learning type systems, if you will. So I think if you can show a cost savings, you will get people's attention. I think also I like to emphasize differentiation. There are so many, let's use an example, math products out there, or English products, or science products, that schools always tell me, gee, George, I get a couple emails a day from a new math product. How do I know how good it is? So I always tell companies they need to differentiate, and particularly now, why is your product so great? What is its uniqueness that stands out? What are some of the results and success and outcomes that will get people's attention? I think that's important. And I do think, and this is not unique, maybe the Middle East, but schools in many of the products would want to do pilots. A lot of companies are not used to doing that without charging, and they've got to kind of see how they work around those kind of issues if they want to make sales. I have found doing some pilots in the Middle East with schools has usually resulted in sales, maybe in 2-3 months. They like the product, and they've got the budget to either buy it with discretionary funds or to switch things around depending on the price tag. And I think companies have got to getting out and learning. They can't just market by sending emails. That doesn't necessarily produce great results. But I do think having webinars where they're talking about a trend or some kind of, not a sales pitch, but showing the value of their thought leaders, if you will. And then I think attending events like GESS and whatever are important to attend and see what's going on, get a feel for things. And Steve brought up, and I've done over the last couple of years with some clients, workshops in Kuwait and in Dubai, where we invited schools, and we did it right around the GESS event, maybe the weekend before, and we'd have 100, 150 people attend from maybe 70 or 80 schools. And I always tell people, that's cost effective. Try to imagine visiting 70 or 80 schools. And that has resulted in building relationships, possibly developing some sales, getting better known. So, and this, I know this can also be financially, the companies have to look at that, but the trade-off might be a cost-effective way, and then tie in with the GESS conference in November this year. And that's actually the last time I was in Dubai was a year ago, March, when everything hit. I think I even saw Jim and visited his school about that time, the last time. So anyway, those are some comments I'd make. And I always get back to how important relationships are. I have found during this period, even with Zoom and being Zoomed to death, that staying in touch with people, even if it was to have a Zoom call for 20 minutes, check in, see if there's anything to do. People appreciate that. I've had some situations that's turned out to be very helpful. People getting back in touch, thanking that, hey, glad you stayed in touch. Thanks for sending the information. It wasn't any kind of sales pitch, if you will. So I think that's been helpful, staying in touch with people, and from a customer standpoint, and just even building relationships.
You're very good at that, George, and that was a great answer there, with showing off all of the experience that you have over the years of developing those relationships and building business. I'm going to come to you in a moment, Jim, because I'd like to see what your reaction is to what George had to say there. But the other thing I was going to say about a pilot project, if you're new to the international schools market, it can be a really good way of producing a very good case study, can't it? And the sort of networks that operate within the global market, those kind of case studies, recommendations, referrals can be really important. So I think that's another good reason for an education supplier to think twice about an opportunity to do a pilot scheme like that. So yeah, Jim, I was just going to say, from the perspective of the school, do you see that the way of doing business has changed? And what's really important to you now in terms of what you're looking for from your suppliers?
I think, look, many of us have, and including ourselves, we're a very successful school, but, we did all leap in a bunker to some extent, and we had to prioritize and triage, work out where we could save money, where there was uncertainty, how we could, are our student numbers going to hold up? Recruiting staff has been harder. All those things. I used to have the luxury of going to, we're mainly an Australian curriculum school, so going to Melbourne once a year to recruit teachers from there, and we've had to rethink that, certainly for the time being, although hopefully Australia will get vaccinated, we can open up again. But it's, I think as we emerge, and that's not a bad word, we have all learned from this experience. At the end of the day, schools are successful businesses. Your own data, the data Nalini, makes sense to me. I can see that. I'm pleasantly surprised. I thought there might have been a dip in the last 12 months, and there's still been some growth, and that growth is forecast to continue. And I'm not entirely surprised, because whilst there, I don't know the population data in the UAE, for example. I know there have been numbers of expats that have returned back to their home countries, but equally there's still people that are coming out the other way as well. And the interesting thing we're seeing, bear in mind, we consider ourselves a bit of a flagship school in Sharjah in Northern Emirates. We were set up by His Highness Sheikh Sultan, the ruler of Sharjah. But actually, like the country itself, we only have about 15% Emiratis, but we are seeing more interest. Some of our other campuses across Sharjah are specifically aimed at that demographic, although they have access to free education. they are prepared to pay for a quality education. So, I think there is still plenty of opportunities. And look, I know I'll say this, I know we're hard to sell to. I get the emails, I get the LinkedIn requests, I get the phone calls. I try and remember what it's like on the other side. But equally, we have to sort the wheat from the chaff a bit. We've done some very successful, and it works both ways for schools, much as, a supplier might be certain they've got the product, the killer product. It's got to work. Schools have, we have our own reputation to preserve. One of the first key partnerships we embarked on was with Apple, who, have a bit of a good reputation. But that was, again, there was quite a period of courtship on both sides just to make sure it was going to work. And, I think it's worth producers and suppliers remembering that, it is just persistence, building relationships. To be honest, the Zoom thing has worked great. I think knowing that I've just got to dial in for 15, 20 minutes to have a quick chat is a help. But I do like the face-to-face thing as well. So, keep trying everything. At the end of the day, you've got your sales teams. They do it better than I have. And I know, as I say, I know it's hard to get hold of people like us sometimes. But, it's just having that understanding that I'd love to sit and have a chat with a supplier or have a cup of tea with someone. But at the end of the day, I've got to do a COVID quarantine and I've lost 8 staff. So, there'll be less of the latter and more of the former, I hope. And certainly getting back to going to conferences, seeing the suppliers in their stands, networking with people is something we've sorely missed and are looking forward to getting back to.
Thanks very much indeed, Jim. Well, we're almost out of time, but I know that Danny said it didn't matter if we ran over a little bit. So I am just going to ask a final question to each of you. So if you could keep your answers nice and trim, that would be great. We've talked a lot about positives here, which I think is just fantastic. So what is it, I want to ask each of you, that most excites you about the future for education in this wonderful part of the world? And again, bear in mind, we're not just talking about the UAE, but we're talking about the whole of the Middle East. Steve, can I come to you first and ask you, what excites you about the Middle East for the future?
You mean apart from it being a great part of the world with wonderful people, with great climate, culture? It's funny, when I first started doing this role and I was tasked with going to the Middle East, I had a real fear of going there and really didn't think I was going to like it. And on about the 4th visit, I realised that I'd actually completely and utterly fallen in love with the people and the culture and the area, because it is a wonderful place. It is all about relationship, which is why we keep coming back to this in-person thing. You do have to work at it. You do have to build a relationship. You have to expect that culturally it's different. You are not going to walk in the door and be able to talk about product within the first 3 minutes. It's not going to happen. They want to know about you. They want to know about your family. They want to get to know you as a person before they're interested in talking work. What excites me? Obviously, huge growth, continued growth, even coming out of a pandemic. No signs of that really slowing down to any great extent. It is a wealthy potential client, generally speaking. Many of the schools, even in the mid-range budget, have got far more discretionary funding than you're probably used to seeing in a UK or a US school. It has got shorter buying cycles because they tend to be closer to the top. Those decisions made much more quickly. More professional in many cases, because they are running as a business and they understand the business ethic and etiquette that perhaps you don't see in state schools. Beyond that, places like Saudi, who are undergoing magnificent change, who are really throwing out their entire education system and starting again. The opportunities there are huge. Don't get me wrong, dealing in Saudi has never been easy, and it never will be. And culturally is probably one of the most difficult in the Middle East. However, the opportunities there are huge. And I think it is going to be a real growth area for many European and American companies.
Great, thank you. George, what about you? What is it that you're looking forward to particularly?
Well, I have found the region, because of my own personal background, to be very exciting. I mean, when you think about UAE, it was became a country around 1971, 72, and look what's happened there. And you look around the region. It also keep in mind that half the population in the Middle East is under 25. Big demand for education and into different skill areas, if you will. And governments, if you look at most of their budgets, education and healthcare, the two top priorities. So when you look at both those markets, the international schools, the government ones, big growth areas. And I think something else that I have found exciting, look at the UAE. It shot up the 2 astronauts a couple of years ago. They shot up the rocket to Mars before the US and China is. They've developed a space agency. There's now a new Arab space agency they're forming. That's why there's a big push in STEM in a lot of those areas. I think all that's very exciting. You're seeing a lot of companies in those areas, space commercialization, if you will. And that's why I think a lot of schools, and I'm sure gyms, the whole STEM area are becoming important. So I just think it's a dynamic area that's going to continue to grow over the, out in the next, years here with everything that's going on, including Saudi, where there's a lot of emphasis I'm getting on their Vision 2020, and education's a high priority there.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Jim, you've already told us how excited you are about opening the school up next year and everybody coming back. But what's the big thing that you've got? What's the most exciting thing that you've got planned for the school for the next year?
Well, look, we've had students on site all year, but it is that, we want to take a big step back to normality, rebuild that community. So Sharjah weren't allowing the extracurricular activities that Dubai schools were doing. So getting those going again, doing community events, having, when we can and when it's safe, having parents back on site. It's something we did very well and something we've really missed. And commercially, just getting back to some sort of, as we've talked about in the last hour, looking at what has worked well for us, what we will carry over, looking at those products that haven't let us down, that we want to use even when we're back to online teaching, that have made life easier. So, it's, and I think actually I reflect again on GESS itself and other events like it, one of the things as a school leader that I've always enjoyed doing, because as a head teacher, it's quite lonely. There's no one else in the building doing your job. For the last 10, 15 years in the UK and the UAE, I've enjoyed going to conferences, going to shows, meeting other people who do the same job that I do. And we haven't been able to do that quite as easily. So getting back, standing in a trade fair, chatting to suppliers, chatting to colleagues, exchanging ideas, that's something that, we've got through this, but we want to come out the other side now and really build on that.
Yeah. Thanks very much. Nalini, you've already shared with us lots of exciting data and new schools opening, etc. But anything you think you've missed that you should be telling us about that's on the horizon?
I was scribbling notes when you asked the question, and actually it's been really good to hear that basically everything that I'd written down has already just been mentioned. So we're all thinking along the same lines, which is good to hear. I would echo the youth of the region's population is super exciting. That's what's leading to all these developments of new schools. George, I think, mentioned that children and young people are half of the region's population. In Saudi and Egypt, 30% of the population is under 14, and they're really hungry for international schooling. They're hungry for good education, but they're really hungry for international curricula. So I think that's important to note. The innovation, again, as was mentioned earlier, places like Dubai, the KHDA, it's very forward thinking. It can take a while to change things, but certainly they're looking for innovation. They're looking to change the way they do things. And on the flip side, you've got countries like, Jordan, Egypt, perhaps government bodies aren't necessarily as innovative, but schools are actually under very little government regulation there for private international schools. So therefore, the schools themselves can be innovative. So that's certainly worth considering. And finally, I'd say the thing that's incredibly exciting is this increased opening we're seeing of more affordable schools. And I certainly think that's where we're going to see the market booming across pretty much every country in the region. Anything that suppliers can offer to help support these mid-market schools with a strong curriculum or various products within their budget, I think that's going to be a real huge area of growth.
That's excellent. Thanks very much. So clearly lots and lots to be excited about. I'm a little bit disappointed that nobody suggested one of the most exciting things is going to be England winning the World Cup in Qatar next year. But anyway, hey ho. We haven't managed to answer all
Dream
of the
on, dream on.
We haven't managed to answer all of the questions, Danny, but I'm sure we'll be able to follow up. I just wanted to say thank you very much to all the panelists. I think it's been a great discussion, and I hope everybody listening has enjoyed it.
I'm sure they have. And Diane, don't forget, the World Cup in Qatar is right after GESS the following week. So it's a perfect opportunity to travel there right after the show. Brilliant. Thank you so much, everyone.
I might add there, Danny, that we didn't mention, and Diane brought up a good point. There are companies that have approached me looking at products around the World Cup for next year.
That's very interesting.
In the gaming area, virtual games.
Esports, definitely. That's a big trend that we've seen at schools in the region as well. Perfect. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Diane, George, Jim, Nalini, and Steve for providing us with such valuable insight. As I'm sure you realize, and Diane, you've pointed it out, we've had so many questions come in from the audience, some of which we unfortunately couldn't get to, but we'll send them across to you right after the webinar and hopefully get back to the person who has asked them as soon as possible. If anyone from the audience has any further questions or would like to connect with our speakers, please send an email to marketing@gesseducation.com. You'll also be redirected to a short survey once we end the webinar, so please tell us what you thought. Your feedback would be highly appreciated. A massive thank you to our panel and also you, our audience. We hope that you found this discussion beneficial. And just a reminder that GESS Dubai 2021 will take place in person from the 14th to the 16th of November. You can find more information about the event in the show brochure and floor plan in the handouts section. Or for any questions that you might have, please don't hesitate to contact us by emailing sales@guestdubai.com. We're really looking forward to welcoming you all to the show. Enjoy the rest of your day. Take care and bye-bye for now.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.